Hello again, I'm Tom Stapledon, and I'm here with another one of my talks and slideshows on behalf of the Friends of Williamson Tunnels. This time, I'm going back to the Paddington cellars. We've been there so many times before in my talks, there's so much to say about them. I'm going to cover some old ground, of course, again, but I'm going to give it a new slant, and I'm going to give you my thoughts basically on a belief that I have about another cellar system below these buildings that Williamson put up, which we haven't discovered yet, but which I'm absolutely convinced is there. So we'll make a start with this. We're back in the district of Edge Hill, of course, in what is now the city of Liverpool. Was a little village out in the country years ago in Williamson's time, barely a village even. And here we are looking down Wavertree Road. The bottom of Wavertree Road is this area here, which is called Holland Place. Still there, only it doesn't look like a circle anymore. It's a sort of a triangle of land where various roads meet. But we're looking down from the bottom of Wavertree Road, and straight ahead down there is Paddington. Walk down Paddington a few yards and turn left along Mason Street, and you would have reached Mr. Williamson's own house. Up until 1840, that is. And in the background here, just in a silhouette behind this tree, is the outline of the set of buildings that Joseph Williamson put up at the top of Paddington, somewhere in the time region of about 1836 to 1840. One of his last projects, I believe, before he died. In fact, they may not have even quite been finished by the time he died. Couldn't possibly say. On the right here is the Bear's Paw pub. The building's still there, but no longer a pub. And on the left, a place I have mentioned before, behind the horse and carriage, is a large detached house known as Derby House. Now, Derby House was originally, obviously, the house of quite a wealthy person, and it had its gardens on this side, driveway, leading out onto Wavertree Road, looking up Wavertree Road. But it's a strange house because at a later date, and I couldn't tell you exactly when, it was turned around. And the front became the back and the back became the front. Now, I'm not sure why I'm showing you this, but it came my way quite recently, and I thought I'd include it for no particular good reason. It's labelled as an etching, Old House Number 3, Highgate Street, Edge Hill, viewed from the rear of shops in Holland Place. Now, that may be correct in that a row of tall buildings that became known as Derby buildings were built where a lot of the garden and driveway area of Derby House used to be. And this appears to still be Derby House as it was, because the front door is still there. But we know that in later years, it was turned into a pair of semi-detached houses with their entrances on the opposite side into Highgate Street. So a little bit confusing. Here we're looking at the Bear's Paw pub on the corner, top of Paddington. This is number 126 Paddington, the top building in the block of 4 that Williamson built, which became Luntz the Bakers for many, many years. It does say number 118 up there on the top, but it was the buildings were renumbered a number of times through their life. And this one became number 126 Paddington, but it was 118 at the time of this painting, which I think was sometime in the 1850s. And looking across the street here, Highgate Street, we have the rear of Derby House. As you can see, it's still the rear. There are no doors there. So this is before the time of the Derby buildings being built. This row of shops here were demolished, and a bigger row of shops going sort of on a curve around the corner was built in place. Quite tall, impressive looking buildings still there. And they were called Derby buildings. Just go forward a little bit here with a map, which I know is pre-1939, but I don't know what year it dates to. So here we have Holland Place. Still got that turning circle in the middle of Holland Place, Irvine Street, Paddington, with the Bear's Paw pub on the corner here. And here at the top of Paddington is that set of 4 Williamson buildings in one block, number 120, 122, 124, and 126, as they became. Next door to it is Highgate Street. And this building here is what was that detached house, Derby House, and was converted into a pair of semis with its front doors out onto Highgate Street here. And by the time of this Ordnance Survey plan, we now have Derby buildings here. Large set of buildings, taking up a lot of what used to be the gardens and driveway of the Derby House as it used to be. I'll tell you in a minute why I'm working up to this. Incidentally, not many people would have realised it, but right behind the Bear's Paw public house, there was a theatre for many, many years, from about the beginning of the 20th century. It was Paddington, oh dear, I forget what it was called. Paddington Playhouse or something like that. Anyway, it's long gone, obviously. Here, from the usual view that we know of it, the only really good photograph, painting that we've got of it, is the set of Williamson buildings, 120, 122, 124, and 126, Paddington. If you look at it closely, it's fairly obvious that although this is a block of buildings, it appears to be 2 pairs of buildings of rather different architecture. The top pair are 4 stories high, slightly higher up the street, and the lower pair are 5 stories high, coming down the street. And whether they were all built together at the same time, or whether one pair went up first and the other pair went up afterwards, we really don't know. But they are definitely quite different in their architectural style, which has to say something. Right next to it is where Back Mason Street slips in behind that block and the next shop down the street. Now, here's a photograph from, I believe it's 1968. And this is Highgate Street here. And now we have Derby House, which is being converted. It's obviously just about to be pulled down at this stage. It's obviously fairly derelict. And we have now a pair of front doors side by side here. They will have put a partition wall right up the middle of the building where there wasn't one before and turned it into 2 houses. Now, I've been reliably informed, I hope this is correct, that the right-hand half of that Derby House was occupied by families. But the left-hand half, we believe, was occupied by a chemist by the name of Mr. Lomax. And Mr. Lomax used this building, his half of the building, as a sort of a workshop. In his early days, medicines would have been made up on the premises, pills would have been bottled on the premises, bottles would have come back over and over to be reused, recycled. The bottles would have been cleaned off of their labels and washed out and all the rest of it. And medicines were put into bottles all over again. And this happened in this building. This is what this building was used for, as Mr. Lomax's workshop. And from the rear of the building, you go out through a back door, across a yard, and round to the left behind this building, to where the rear of Mr. Lomax's chemist shop was. So from the rear of this building, you would go across the yard and into the back room of the chemist shop, which was sort of adjoining. So the story I've heard, and I really don't know whether I can be 100% sure of it or not, but I was told by our treasurer, Claire Moorhead, who got the story from somewhere, that at some point this building, the kids got into it and they set fire to it, and it was completely gutted by fire. It was determined later that the damage was so bad that the building couldn't be saved. And so they say the whole building was demolished, and the bricks and mortar and everything left inside it all went down below into a very deep cellar underneath it. We heard stories about a bottle washing lad who worked in this building, and when he had broken or cracked or damaged bottles, he used to drop them through a hole in the floor and there was a sort of a long wait before you heard them crash into the pile at the bottom, which sort of led to the impression that this was another one of those buildings with a very deep cellar below. I don't think anybody is for 1 minute trying to suggest that this was built by Joseph Williamson, or that the cellar below was created, by quarrying by Joseph Williamson, but it's a bit of a coincidence when he did so much of that thing on his own property. Anyway, we have a rather interesting little pen and ink drawing here. Came my way a long time ago, and I never had any explanation of what it was or what it was about. But of course, it has got the wording on there: Joseph Williamson's tunnels revealed in Highgate Street. I found a little bit more about it just recently from our researcher, Don Hyam, who'd known all about this this drawing for a long time, but that information had never been conveyed to me until quite recently. But if you look at it closely, this is from the 1930s. You can tell that from that truck for a start. And look at that building in the background. That is the rear of Derby House after it's been converted into semis, and that is that pair of front doors with a portico over the top and that rather distinctive circle design above the two doors. So this is right opposite in Highgate Street, right opposite to the rear of the Joseph Williamson block of houses. Oh, sorry, the block of shops that he built, the 5-story block. And for some reason, and I really have no reason, no information about why, this tunnel under the street was exposed at some point through the 1930s. Whether it was accidentally, was there a collapse in the road? Was it during the demolition of buildings along Highgate Street? Because the whole of the area bounded by Mason Street, Paddington and Highgate Street was being flattened through the 1930s, from about 1934 right up to 1939, with the Williamson block of buildings and other shops facing onto Paddington being the last to go. But all the housing behind in this area was being demolished through the 1930s. So could it be that during the demolition, a hole appeared in the ground and they exposed something and realized that it was a tunnel going under the street? We'll never really know. What I can tell you is a rather strange bit of information, I suppose, but this was drawn by a lady or a girl, I don't know, named Myrtle Seymour. And the information that's just come my way about it is that Myrtle Seymour must have been an employee of Vernon's Pools. And at one time during the 1930s, they sort of made some efforts to encourage their employees to take an interest in art and things like that. And Myrtle Seymour seems to have made this drawing, and it was actually unearthed by one of our friends in a library, and thought it was something that would be of interest to us and passed it on. So that's all I know about it, but quite an interesting little story. Now then, directly across the road, across the other side of Highgate Street from the drawing that you've just been looking at, where Derby House stood, were the business premises and the home of George Lineker. This is one of George Lineker's invoices. All his stationery, invoices and letterheads and the like, had this rather nice drawing on the top. And they carried on using them right up into the 1940s, even though this was completely out of date by that time. Who drew it? I don't know. Maybe Mr. Lineker did it himself, or maybe somebody did it for him and he was very attached to the drawing. This depicts the row of Williamson buildings, the tall buildings here on Paddington, with this top one being number 126, which was the baker's shop of George Lunt. And directly behind, tucked into the area behind the big buildings, is number 2 Highgate Street, which was the home of George Lineker. And this would be his sort of business office workshop on the street in front of the house. Now, it's rather complicated dealing with George Lineker, because I think I might have explained once before in one of my previous talks, there were actually 3 generations of George Lineker, and they all ran this business one after another. It passed on through the family. We're interested in this particular case in the second George Lineker. He was a man called George Herbert Lineker, and he was born in 1858 and he died in 1832. The second of 3 generations, all running that business, and they'd all lived in that house as well. So we've got here what I consider to be a really important and very interesting single-page piece of writing by George Herbert Lineker. And he's titled it Reminiscences of Old Liverpool by George Lineker Sr., but of course he wasn't the senior, really. He was in relation to his son, but he's made mistakes in this little piece of writing about Edge Hill. Right in the first sentence there, he says, Joseph Williamson arrived in the Edge Hill district of Liverpool in 1700, which is obviously completely wrong, because we know that Joseph Williamson was born in 1769. So there's no way he was here at that time. He came up to Edge Hill around 1805 or 1806, we believe. So obviously he has made mistakes there, but there's a piece right in the middle of this little memoir which is vitally important as far as I'm concerned, and I personally believe that it's absolutely correct. Anyway, I'm just going to read this little bit to you. He says, 120 to 124 Paddington was occupied by William Booth, a grocer. The writer had occasion in 1898 to go into the basement of Booth's. The bottle washing department was in a bricked, arched tunnel, 2 stories below the actual basement of the shop. So we're already looking at 3 stories down. There are 3 or 4 tunnels about 10 feet high and 30 feet long. The end of one was bricked up. In later years, the writer had the opportunity to explore further. With companions, he cut through the brickwork, found a stone staircase, and descended into a murky passage and to further tunnels. In the lowest, they had to stoop and found they were walking on solidified stout. At 126 Paddington, that's the top building of the block of 4, the arrangement was different. This was the bakery of George Lunt. From the ground floor, stone steps went down into a well-ventilated basement. The bakehouse was in the basement, and from it led several tunnels extending 12 or so feet under the roadway. These were used as ovens. Right. I feel as if this is a completely correct piece of writing. I don't think there's any room for false memories. What he says about 126 Paddington rings absolutely true. The fact that we didn't find any tunnels going under the road with bakery ovens in is because they will have been in the first basement level below ground, which had been completely destroyed when the Williamson buildings were demolished in 1939. So when we arrived in 1999 and got in there, what we went down into was the second level of the working cellars, basements below these buildings, with the one above it having been totally destroyed, unfortunately. So we dug all our way down to 60 feet below ground and found nothing leading off anywhere else. And so I think it's fair to assume that those bakery ovens were there and that they were underneath the street, going over Highgate Street towards Derby House on the other side. In the first paragraph that I read, that little piece there, in the lowest level, they had to stoop and found that they were walking on solidified stout. Now, I really don't believe anybody ever would make up a sentence like that out of nowhere. But what we know is that William Booth, the grocer, was there from about 1869 right up until about 1905 running his business. And he was bottling beers and wines and lemonade and all that sort of thing. And that was being done in the lower levels of the basements for cellars. So it's perfectly reasonable, I would have thought, over all those years of bottling beers, that there would have been wastage, there would have been spillage, maybe the back end of barrels with sediment were just tipped out and went down below into the lowest levels that weren't actually used for anything at all, because they were basically only left over from Joseph Williamson's quarrying and never intended to be used for anything else. So I think this is totally and utterly believable, and it points to me to the fact that there is another deep basement right next door to the one we've got, because as I'll explain in a minute, we've only got the half of it. Just going to go back to this for a moment. As you can see now, tunnels going towards Derby House, that is across Highgate Street from directly below or right behind the Williamson buildings. So I think there's every reason to believe that that is true, and that there were tunnels just below street level going under the street, and that they would have been utilised with for George Lunt to put his bakery ovens. So I'm completely believing of that story. Now then, moving on to another piece of writing which also corroborates my thinking. I've shown this before, and I've probably read it before as well. I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but just thought it might be interesting to read bits of it. This is a trade directory called Liverpool of Today, the maritime metropolis of the world. We believe it was written sometime in the 1880s, and it's an entry in the trade directory for the business of William Booth, the grocer. And I really have to assume that the entry has been written by William Booth himself. It's one of those directories that you would pay to have an entry in. And so you were entitled to write what you wanted to write. And he did a really good job of promoting his business enterprise and making the most of his wording to make it sound really impressive. So it's just one page, but I'm going to read some bits of it to you. So William Booth, dealer in tea, coffee, Italian goods, wines and spirits, ale and porter bottler, and mineral water manufacturer. 120, 122, 122A, and 124 Paddington, Old Post Office Place, and Back Mason Street. W. Booth is one of the most enterprising and successful men of business in Liverpool. In addition to the extensive premises occupied by him in Breck Road, he has 8 other large establishments in different parts of the city. His offices and wholesale sale room are at 120 Paddington. He has a very commodious coffee roasting and grinding warehouse at 122 Paddington, and tea blending rooms, warehouses, and country department at 122A Paddington. And 124 Paddington is the retail tea and coffee sale room. W. Booth has also a very large mineral water and ale and porter, wine and spirit bottling stores in Back Mason Street. Now, he goes on to describe the wonderful, modern, clean equipment that he uses for his bottling. But as you can see, he does a lot of beer bottling, and it's done in the cellars below. But he also has premises around the corner at Back Mason Street. And I would assume that it's immediately behind the Williamson block of buildings in Back Mason Street. And very likely the cellars created by Joseph Williamson by quarrying out that ground extend below that building as well. And that's where the bottling plant was, and possibly where all this runoff of beer and stout went down into the lowest levels. So I'll move forward a bit to another section. In the cellars, which we shall allude to presently, is carried on the ale and porter bottling, and everything that science can produce and ingenuity suggest to secure thorough cleanliness is in operation. Right in the centre of the warehouse is the hoist, which works from the cellars to the top story. That's interesting, because when our people were first getting into the Paddington cellars, and opening up the original staircase that led down two levels into the two working cellars below the buildings. They found what they believed to be a sort of a lift shaft at the rear of the house, of the building. And they were quite convinced that that had housed something like a dumb waiter kind of thing in a lift shaft, which would have been probably hand operated by pulling on a rope over a pulley, so that goods could be moved from two stories below ground level, through ground level, and up to 5 stories above ground level. The remains of that area is still visible today, and I think that is quite true, that it was probably used as a hoist. But it wouldn't surprise me if it didn't start its life as a light well, because we know that Williamson was supposed to have built some of his buildings with rooms that had no windows in them. And there's a suggestion that that particular lift shaft started life as a light well put in just so they could get some light into some of the rear rooms of the buildings, because he'd managed to build them without. Where have I got to? The hoist which works from the cellars to the top story. Within the last few months, W. Boot has put down printing machinery, which enables him to do all his own printing, including labels, invoices, tea papers, window bills, and plain and fancy work of every description. We also know he produced a newspaper, the Edge Hill Journal, but that only seemed to last for a year. Maybe it's just an experiment that he didn't bother carrying on. Also, we may mention paper bags are made on this story in adjoining rooms. The premises where all this business is carried on are very remarkable, being erected many years ago by rather an eccentric gentleman named Mr. Joseph Williamson, or as he was known to the neighbourhood, the King of Edge Hill, who took great delight in building arches underground. This building is 5 stories, and the cellars from the street parapet are as deep as the building is high. The tiers of splendid arched cellars, one over the other, exhibit skill of workmanship in masonry rarely met with. The roof is flat, with an intense cistern which contains many tons of water and is always full, there being no way of running it out. The cistern rests on the centre wall of the building. Building is erected in one of the highest parts of the town, and from the roof the whole of Liverpool and surrounding country can be seen on a clear day. So that's backing up what I've read from the memoir of George Lineker about the deep cellar systems, 2 of them side by side. And I think that pretty much sounds conclusive to me, because something that didn't occur to me and didn't occur to any of us while we were digging this place out and afterwards was that by the time we'd emptied out these deep cellars, look at that, that is the lowest level of our Paddington cellars, level 4. By the time we'd emptied this out, it looked so enormous, it didn't occur to any of us that this is only half of it. This is only what lies below number 124 and 126 Paddington. It seems too big, but it isn't. It's only under those 2 buildings. Here we're looking from one end to the other of level 4 at a point in time, a very short time, when we had no staircase because we'd had to take the wooden stairs out, and before we got our tower staircase in, which stands there now and brings people down to the lowest levels. This is looking with your back to the wall that would have been adjoining the other pair of cellars, if you like, under 120 and 122, looking right through between the 2 buttresses there towards the far end, which is right up against Highgate Street, and looking in the other direction, equally long, back to the wall, which is right next to Highgate Street, and looking right through to the other end of this pair of buildings, 126 and 124, but not under the whole block. I don't know why it took me so long to realize this, but then, of course, reading again the memoirs of George Lineker and reading this piece in the trade directory, it seems perfectly obvious that this is only half of what's there. If only we could find the other half, that we may never get the opportunity to dig under there. I'm just going to finish off with this. This is a 3D laser scan that was done of our Paddington cellars. It might not make a lot of sense to most people, but here is our entrance hatch and we go down one level, one flight of stairs, then down another flight of stairs and into the level 2 cellars sitting on top here with their stone flagged floor. And below that, the level 3 cellar there, and then the very deep one, the level 4 cellars that you've just seen in those 2 photographs, going from there all the way down to there, 60 feet below ground. But this is only below 2 of those 4 buildings. The end of 126, the end of 124 there, and the other pair of buildings off to the left beyond. So I don't think we have much prospect of ever finding the other pair of cellars. We were so lucky to find a way into this pair in 1999, and it was a real stroke of luck that we were in the right place at the right time, and our digger found a way in for us. But to find a way into the other pair of cellars, which would probably be equally deep, maybe of a completely different design, but probably as deep as this, it definitely talks of at least 4 levels. To get access to that, I think we might have to wait for our children and grandchildren to be around and still interested enough when the student flats complex that lies above our land are finally knocked down. And there might be another opportunity to poke around on that land next door and maybe find a way in then. But other than that, I think they're going to remain lost forever, just like our cellars were if we hadn't just struck lucky on that day, 17th of July, 1999, and found a way in at the 2nd level. So that's about all I've got to show you on that one. That is how I come to believe fully that there is a 2nd cellar system underneath there waiting to be found. But whether it'll ever happen, I really don't know. Anyway, thank you for watching.